maybe if you don't want to talk, you could just listen.
What is happening? I am Mal Foster and you are listening to the latest episode of your third favourite above average but infinitely curious podcast, Dimed Out. What is happening? How are we doing? How is everybody feeling? Can you believe that we are almost at the end of season 2? That has just flown by. I mean, I know that the last year and a bit, the very already abstract idea of time has kind of been pummeled into a completely different, unrecognisable shape, but it feels like it's changed again. It feels like things are moving quicker. It feels like there is fluidity again. Maybe it's because there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, possibly because there isn't a tyrannical baby in charge over here anymore. I don't know. I'm not saying these things are a definite factor, but I am certainly saying they help. So, I imagine most of you listening are going to be celebrating at this little bit of news. This week is a guest week. That's right. It is not just me and my innate ramblings and musings. Although if you do like that kind of nonsense, then you definitely want to check out the last 2 episodes 13 and 14, in which I read from my ill-fated, abandoned travel memoir and the time I spent in New York back in 2015. Yeah, so if you've ever wondered why I am the way that I am, that's a really good insight into that. It takes a look at New York, Bushwick, Brooklyn in particular, through the eyes of me and my 30-year-old socially anxious, neurotic, jittery, catastrophizing mindset. Yeah, it is something. And I'm throwing the word something in there as a versatile replacement word. You could put a number of things in there to describe it. For me, it was very much a multi-dimensional, eye-opening experience, going back 6 years, looking at who I was, and sometimes it was kind of cringy and embarrassing, but it was also actually very, as I say, eye-opening to see who I was and to, more importantly, see who I am now. So yeah, if you do like the innate ramblings and nonsense and you haven't checked out the last 2 episodes, then yeah, highly recommend. But that was then, and this is now. And as I said just a few moments ago, this week is a guest week, and our special guest this week is Audrey from the Anatomyth podcast, a recently released podcast that merges mythology, folklore, and medicine. Yeah, it is a really interesting concept, and it's one that she is absolutely crushing in the episodes that she's put out so far. Yeah, seriously, if you love learning and being entertained at the same time, then you cannot go far wrong with checking out Anatomyth. I will be putting links in the show notes over at dimed-out.com for this episode, but in the meantime, rather than tell you about it, let's jump into the conversation with Audrey and learn about Anatomyth, how it started, why it started, her love for mythology. We're also going to learn some pretty wild myths in the process, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure chatting with Audrey, and I hope you guys enjoy the conversation half as much as I did. So yeah, let's get into it. What is Anatomyth for those that are new to this?
So it's a podcast that explores the medicine or potential medicine behind certain myths, certain folklore. It's based around the idea that, you know, mythology and folklore and all of these other stories we've been telling for centuries, they're a kind of primitive science. You know, it's something that our ancestors used to describe the world to kind of figure out why things happen. And so I just took that, and me being a medical student, and, you know, like I grew up around folklore mainly, and I've always been a bit of a mythology nerd. I figured I put the two together.
It is a really interesting concept. And when I discovered this, when we kind of first started talking, I was like, this is actually really fascinating, because there are a lot of podcasts that deal with different aspects, and there are some that dip into folklore, but I've not heard of one that kind of draws parallels or has sort of like a jumping off point from mythology and folklore to actual medical conditions and medical aspects that you see in modern day. What led you to create Anatomyth in the first place? What kind of gave you the idea as in, okay, this is something that I think could work?
I was actually sitting in class, one of my professors, and I remember this very clearly because it was right before the whole pandemic hit. And so I'm in Italy and we went into lockdown quite a bit earlier than most of the rest of the world. Yeah. And I remember because I think we had 1.5, maybe 2 weeks of class um, of our second semester right before everything went online. And I was sitting in class, I was looking up at the slides, and one of our professors, he was, I don't even remember what the main topic was, but it was just a tiny point on that slide. And it said liver, and then in parentheses, it had Hephaestus on it. And I don't know if you're familiar with the myth of Hephaestus, but he was, in Greek mythology, he stole fire from the gods and he gave it to humans. And for that, he was punished. And he was on a mountain, he was tied to that mountain, and every day an eagle would come and peck out his liver, and overnight it would grow. And it was basically this idea that we can cut the liver down to a certain size and it will still grow back more or less. And I remember because I think that's the third time in as many years I've seen that. I don't know if it's Italian professors or if it's just medicine professors everywhere that I was like, why does this keep coming up? And I remember, I think I remembered at that point, because that was also the time when I was getting more into science podcasts. Before then, it was primarily storytelling and mythology and folklore. And I was like, hey, hang on, this is an idea. And that's basically what started all of it.
Is that right about the liver? It can grow back no matter what size it gets down to?
Not really no matter what size, but you can resection it with you can preserve you have to preserve some of the blood vessels, obviously, in like a certain this is like really bad. I'm a medical student. I should know this, but I don't know what size and which, but you can cut off bits of it and it will grow back.
You got to have something to work with, I guess, essentially.
Yeah, that is definitely true.
Probably not the medical textbook term, but we'll go with that. I like to keep things layman, Audrey. It's how I understand most things, so we'll go with that. But that's fascinating, and that is something we'll kind of tap into, because I have listened to the first 2 episodes, and there's already a lot of things that you've covered which I didn't actually know, which, as I say, we'll get into that in a little bit, because I do find it really fascinating in 2 folds. So you say you're a medical student. Is this something that you've always pursued? Is this something that you've always wanted to do? Is medicine?
I would say for maybe more than the last 10 years, it is something that I've known that I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Before that, it was archaeology.
Okay, so I can kind of see how the two sort of tie in here. So you've kind of had a previous interest in history, obviously, and then you've moved on to medicine, and you've kind of found sort of a middle ground, I guess, with what you're doing.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I do actually, the end goal was always forensic pathology, so medical examiners. And I think that really ties in with kind of archaeology, anthropology. That's something I've always been interested in.
What kind of field of medicine is it that you're studying, if you don't mind me asking?
Right now I'm just in kind of regular, I don't know but medical school, and then once you graduate you can start specializing. You do your residency.
Okay.
Yeah,
I only ask because this is all
still got a couple years to go.
This is all completely alien to me, so I've just while I have a medical student, it's just kind of curious to kind of dig into a world I don't know. So I as I said, I feel this is a very unique concept for a podcast, and I feel like it is very interesting and entertaining, but also educational for new listeners who haven't dived in yet. And I'm stressing the word yet because I know that they're going to go dig into Anatomyth. What are some of the sort of topics that you've covered so far that listeners can jump into here?
So the first episode is more kind of on nightmare creatures. Nightmare creatures, they're you can find them in most cultures and the folklore, and I think they're just kind of cryptids that have been around forever. And usually there is a link with sleep paralysis. And I think in some cultures, the word for the nightmare creature is the same word for sleep paralysis. There's a connection there. But I didn't take it that way. I took it to, it's a sleep disorder, like a breathing disorder that occurs when you're sleeping. It's called obstructive sleep apnea. And just kind of played around a little bit. It doesn't fit as perfectly as sleep paralysis would with kind of nightmare creatures and what they do to a person, to a sleeping victim, let's say. But I like to stress that the podcast is not something you should take too seriously. Like the myth part and the medicine, everything is well researched, but the connection is sometimes a little hazy. So yeah, that's the first episode. The second episode, I kind of delve into snakes, like venom, and these venomous / poisonous snakes. They're in a lot of mythologies as well, a lot of different mythologies, folklore, even I think local legends. They all have their version of like a snake that can either, spit poison or just kind of breathe on you, like without the fire, and you'd be dead or you'd be in extreme agony. And so I took that and I looked into what real life snakes can kind of spit at you, and that is a thing that does happen. There are spitting cobras out there, and the main issue that'll happen with that, like ocular envenomation, it's when snake venom gets into your eyes, and what happens when that would happen. The third episode is, there's quite a bit more of history in it. I look at these horned deities, so basically gods, medicine men, hermits who have horns on their heads. And I look at, there's an actual skin condition called cutaneous horns, where horns grow on different parts of the body. And so I just kind of looked at that and certain historical cases of that and why it happens and why you should be worried.
Yeah, I found the first episode really interesting because I actually have suffered from sleep apnea in the past. And I was like,
really?
Yeah. And so it was kind of interesting to kind of get more of an insight into to why that happens.
Before I launched the podcast, I sent kind of an audio of the first episode, like a mock up, to a few friends and asked for feedback. And a couple of friends got back to me. They were like, hey, I actually have this.
Yeah.
And I think it's not something that we talk about as much. And I think that's also, it's also about awareness. I think part of why I want to do this, because there are some things that, when we were talking about it in class, I was like, I've never heard of this ever. And it turns out it's quite common. So I was like, there's something here. Maybe we can do something with that.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that, like specifically, because as I say, it's not, and as you say, it's not that common. It's not very well known. A lot of people don't tend to talk about it or even know about it to even talk about in the first place. And I was going to ask, is that something that you specifically had in mind to kind of look at in terms of correlating between the myths and the medical conditions, sort of highlighting some lesser known conditions?
Didn't start out wanting to do that.
Right.
It's really just something that it came up in class. It was part of our course, and it just kind of puzzled me. But at some point, you kind of realize as well that there are a lot of quite common conditions that in the past were just overlooked, or they didn't, like with sleep apnea, the person who's experiencing it, you're not going to figure it out because you're asleep. And it can be quite dangerous, right? Because you're sleepy the rest of the day. And so I do try to highlight that. Now, after that first one, when I was doing the research, I was like, maybe I can keep doing this, keep looking for maybe not so well-known disorders, not so well-known conditions. And the same applies to the myths. I try to actively look for stuff which are new to me as well.
I was going to ask about this, with you mentioning that you kind of you've had an interest in mythology and folklore. I think you described yourself as a folklore nerd earlier.
Yeah.
Is a lot of the stuff that you're bringing to the podcast new stuff that you're digging into and researching and finding out for the first time, or are you using like your base knowledge to begin with? Like, how much of this is new to you?
I would say about 30 to 40% is new. I think for the nightmare episode, especially, quite a few of those were new. I went on the internet. I was like, nightmare creatures.
Wow, I can only imagine what you pulled up in your search results.
Yeah, it was I fell into kind of a black hole there.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of them were, so the idea for the episode, half of it was in class. Like I already said, we talked about obstructive sleep apnea, but our professor was describing it. And I grew up in the Philippines, and I grew up around a lot of folk tales and folk sayings. And in my head, something clicked. I was like, I know this. Like there's a creature in Philippine folklore that does this, not super exactly, but through all of the tellings and retellings I grew up around. So I try to bring that aspect. It's a little difficult for me to find podcasts that tackle kind of the more obscure, like the less well known creatures or stories. And so I think I have an advantage on that part. For the snake episode, most of them I kind of knew. And then it was just a matter of figuring out what the original sources were and to figure out some more new details. So yeah, like a good amount, I would say 30-40% is new, but it's fun for me as well, because then I get to expand my knowledge. And like I have all of these reference books and all of these reference ebooks, and I never pulled them out. I'm always like, I'll read that next time. I'll read it next time. And it's only when I have a project that I'm like, I need to do some more research. And so it's good motivation for me all.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you've got a reason to dive into them and really dig into what they've got.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's cool. It's interesting. You mentioned that, like, sort of realizing that you are not familiar with this particular example, but you have heard of a version of that. And it's interesting to see how many similar sort of folklores and mythical characters and what have you, beings, translate from culture to culture, but just have their own sort of different spin on it.
That's something that interests me a lot as well. And I'm finding more and more connections, let's say, the deeper I go. And, I think part of it has to do also with, just travel and people spreading these stories around.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is also they're just, some ideas that echo across, humanity. I think there's a Doctor Who quote about that. Like ideas echoing across dimensions. And I think maybe that's part of it, or people they observe the same phenomenon and they're like, well, maybe it's this. What else could it be?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Like, because my immediate thought was this seems to be like a grand scale version of the game Telephone, where somebody will say one thing and then it'll kind of move on to the next person and grow and differ and alter. But yeah, I think that is also a really interesting point. The idea of like interpreting different elements of human experience through different cultural lenses, how we kind of, for all of our differences, no matter what corner of the world we're at, we have sort of similar parallels, and that often comes through our experience in life.
Yeah.
And so these core experiences then kind of manifest in variations of the same sort of story or idea or interpretation. It's pretty cool. So one thing I want to ask you, Audrey, is, I mean, we're talking about these sort of folk tales and mythology. The elements that you're covering, and just in general with mythology, is it just purely a case of entertaining folk tales and sort of, I guess, rationalization of things for what people didn't probably understand at the time? Or do you feel like there are any sort of believable parallels that you've come across so far?
I don't know. I try not to delve into this kind of thinking, actually. I think, right, because like the edges get a bit blurry. I think it could be both, who knows, right? I think there's still a lot that's unexplained. And as they say, magic is just science that hasn't been explained yet.
Oh, that's cool. I like that.
I'm sure, right? Like, I think I've read that somewhere, I've heard it somewhere, but there's this general idea that basically if, it seems like magic and if you can't explain it, then probably you're just not looking in the right direction. So it could be part of it. As you mentioned, right, this game of telephone. And I think we all kind of realize that these stories, they've been told over and over and over again. And so the versions that we know now, they're probably not the versions they started out with over the centuries and the millennia, probably. So I think that also plays into it quite a bit.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because over time, details will have
Mhm.
changed and variations will have altered. It'll be interesting in 100 years' time. I mean, we obviously, I say obviously, you never know. You never know. We'll go with that. We probably won't know what they're going to
Yeah.
sound like, but it'd be interesting to know how much more they alter in like 100 years' time. So I want to dip into some of your favorite folk tales or mythological figures. So like some of your all time favorites, like when it comes to mind, what is something that has kind of captured your attention or that has kind of really inspired your interest in this whole thing?
Oh man. Wow. That's a difficult one. I've never had to sit down and think of who my favorite mythical characters were. I would say maybe as for fairy tales, I talked about fairy tales because I'm actually one of the new episodes will be focused on a fairy tale. So for fairy tales, there's a Brothers Grimm fairy tale called Frau Holle or Mother Holle. And I think I have like such a strong connection to it because one of my earliest, I guess, exposures to fairy tales was my dad had this book of like a collection of maybe 10, 12 Brothers Grimm fairy tales for children. And it was a German version. And the stories in that book, let me tell you, they're meant for children, but they are so different from the English versions.
Yeah.
Like there's Frau Holle, which is it's basically about a girl who falls down a well, and she's really hardworking, and she does everything this woman called Mother Holle tells her to. And so by the end of it, she walks through a gate and she's showered with gold coins. And it's your typical Cinderella. She has like a stepmother and a stepsister who are horrible to her. I think in maybe their versions it became stepmother and stepsister. It might have started out as mother and sister actually, because
Uh-huh.
that's something that the brothers did. They over time they edited and they made them more palatable. But anyway, the mother sends her favorite daughter down the well as well. And so this daughter, she's lazy. She doesn't want to do anything. So by the end of it, she walks through a gate and she's covered in tar and it never comes off. And I don't know why. I love the idea of someone just walking around with tar all over them. I think it's like, how does that work?
It's just constantly. It's just attached to her constantly.
Yeah, it just says that she's just covered in tar, and even the picture is just that this young girl, and there's just like black sludge all over her. It's like I think on Nickelodeon they used to dump slime on people. There
Yeah.
was a show where they did that, and it was that, but with just
Wow.
black slime.
Huh. That's
Yeah, it was
interesting.
it was wild.
That's interesting. I
um,
mean, obviously, I don't think the makers of that show were kind of influenced directly by this, but it's interesting how that has
yeah.
permeated from one thing to another.
Right. And I think that's also just, the similar idea of, just things echoing. We always think of the same stuff. As for a myth, one of my favorite myths, I would say, is the Pangs of Ulster. It's a Celtic myth,
Hmm.
and the goddess Macha, she's basically like she's sometimes a horse goddess, sometimes a fertility goddess. We get into this whole idea of the land and fertility and kingship and stuff, but she's forced to run a race when she's like 9 months pregnant and about to give birth, and she
Whoa.
goes into labor right. Yeah, I mean, myths, the kings and the people in myths were terrible. I
Yeah.
think we can all agree that
Oh
there's
yeah.
always some element of why would you do that? How terrible can you be? So anyway, she's forced to run this, and by the end of it, she's in labor and she gives birth to twins, I believe. And she places the curse on all of the people, and for every man there for several generations afterwards. And the days kind of vary. I think it's 4 nights and 5 days, but sometimes it's 9 days. When they're most in need, they will fall down and experience the pangs of labor like she had to.
Wow.
Right. And I was just like, well, it's kind of a bit excessive, but the punishment fits the crime in that case.
I was gonna
So
say
I love that.
I feel like I'm not too fond of people throwing out curses. Usually they seem a little bit unnecessary. But I think in that case, yeah, totally justified.
Yeah, right. Because I guess, but at that point, no one can protest the king anyway. If the king forces you to do something, it's not
Yeah.
like someone from the crowd will just be like, "Hey, maybe not."
Yeah, no one's going to
Um,
be that brave voice to be like, come on, mate, this is a little bit out of line.
right? Like just a little bit excessive, kind of like at least let her give birth first. But
Right.
yeah, so that's one of my favorites.
Wow. See, again, that is something I've never ever heard of, and this is something that I'm finding, as I say, with the first two episodes of your show, is that there is a lot in terms of both the mythological aspect, but also the medical aspect as well. So, for instance, in the second episode, you mentioned is centered around snakes. This is something that
Mhm.
you would think is probably common knowledge, but you break it down in a very simple but straightforward way, the difference between poison and venom. And a lot of people might not even think there is a difference, but there is. So that's in there. And explaining the itis in conjunctivitis. I've heard that term. I've just had tendonitis recently. Didn't realize what the itis
Oh no.
was. So it's really cool because in just two episodes, have found out a number of things, not only about mythology, but about medicine. And kind of shifting gears a little bit to the latter, is that something that you wanted to sort of use the podcast for? Was not to not only just entertain people with these really fascinating stories from history, but to also kind of shine a light on little known medical things and kind of give a little bit of information and education as well as entertainment.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. And I'm really glad that you found it helpful because I'm always a little worried that I get too technical,
No, not
and
at all.
because right, like I've been in medical school and I've been surrounded by these for years now, and I always worry that, well, maybe it's a little too technical, maybe there are too many words that they're not going to understand. I spend a lot of time on YouTube, and some of my favorite medical channels on YouTube where they break down into understandable terms.
Mm-hmm.
They always do that. They're like, why is it called this? It's because of that. And then because that really helps with recall later on and just understanding, when they're not named after the people who discovered them. A lot of diseases, they're quite, once you understand the words which come from Greek or Latin or whatever, once you understand the meaning behind them, kind of like, oh, that's why. So yeah, like I do try to slip that in there and just kind of make it understandable, I guess.
Well, it's working because I mean, if I can grasp it, you're doing all right, Audrey. You're not reading straight from the
Yeah.
textbook. If I can grasp it, but I like that because it does kind of make a lot of sense about things that it's not that people, I suppose, just are ignorant to, but just have maybe not encountered because they're obviously not within that field. Like I say, I'm far removed from medical school, so these are things
Yeah.
that I probably wouldn't have come across in general finding. But in doing so, it's good because, as you say, it kind of creates that sort of recall. Because now I know what the itis in a conjunctivitis or tendonitis means. Next time I hear that slapped on the end of something, I've got a good frame of reference for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really glad anyway. I do always worry about that.
Well, so far you're doing great. What have you got in store for future episodes that people can look forward to? You mentioned that you've recently done an episode based around horns, but what else is
Yeah.
on the agenda?
Yeah, so next up would be a fairy tale based episode. It's a story by the Brothers Grimm, which is also, it's quite obscure. Even I hadn't heard about it. I pretty much just like kind of opened up one of the editions of Grimm's fairy tales and I was reading through it and I was like, wait, that's new. I'd never heard of this. It's a tale. I think it's about the inevitability of death. And this person, he thinks that, death is going to send him some warning signs before he dies, and then he finds out that the warning signs came and he just never saw them for what they were. So it's kind of like fever and gout and all of that. And I delve a little bit into age related illnesses and kind of body degeneration with age.
Yeah,
The story that I also just talked about with Maha, that also features later on. As for labor pains, and think there are a lot of YouTube videos where people try on this kind of machine. It's called a TENS, and I can't remember what it stands for right now, but it's like electrical stimulation something, and it can simulate labor pain. So I thought I'd look into that, and I was like,
Wow.
well, I have the perfect myth in mind for this. um,
I've
yeah,
got just the thing for this.
yep. And another one, quite a bit down the line, will be on and I delve a bit into it, I think, in the second episode where I mentioned the death of Balder from Norse mythology and how he was killed with mistletoe. And mistletoe can be quite poisonous, but it's also being used, or it was used, for cancer research recently. So I thought I'd look into that as well. Yeah.
Wow. See, already just talking to you, let alone having an episode, I'm learning all sorts of stuff. I had no idea. I just thought mistletoe was just that Christmas thing that just got whacked out
Right.
once the. And in the snake episode, this kind of blew my wig back a little bit. The idea that people are using snake venom in facial creams.
Yeah, but I think it's the same idea as Botox, right? Because if it can paralyze your muscles. And I didn't get into the mechanism in the episode because I thought it was a bit too technical. It dealt with like all of these tiny molecules and these ions basically. And I was revisiting it, and I was revisiting my physiology course where we deal with how muscles contract. And I was like, I don't want to go through this again. It's just, I think part of what I love about doing the podcast as well is it's revision for me. There are a lot of concepts that we kind of dealt with in the last few years that with all the new information coming in, it's just kind of pushed to the back of my mind. Like I can kind of like talk about it a little bit, but I'm missing details and important concepts. So it helps me really revise that. But yeah, back to the snake venom. Like I was also surprised in the prices for these things. Like I understand why they're so expensive, but wow, just it's a whole other level. So
yeah, it sounds it. I had never heard of that, and then when I heard you talking about it, I was just like, why? Why?
Because I think like humans are just really resourceful. I understand me as well. When I read about it, I was like, but why would you do that? And it doesn't stop at snake venom as well. I think there's some with bee venom, like from bee stings. I'm like, why would you do that? But I think it also part of it is like, some people would go, why not?
Right.
So I can understand that aspect of it, but yeah, like I'm with you on the why. Like, how would you come up with that?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know who floated that idea and what the initial response was. Like how many people in the board were like, yeah, do you know something, Gerald? I think you're onto something. Snake venom facial cream. Let's get it tested. But you do bring up a good point when you mention that, in the sense that we do have this strange resourcefulness of turning things that could possibly kill us or do some severe damage and then kind of reutilizing them.
I think that has been present like all throughout history as well. Like the first anti-venoms were basically venom as well. Like a lot of the concepts for these ancient medicines which don't really work, let's say, or have kind of like a 50-50 chance of either saving you or killing you. They're based on this idea that, well, if you use it against itself, like vaccines basically, right? Like you
Right.
take part of the virus or you stimulate the virus to use it against the virus. So I think it just ties into that quite a bit.
All right, Audrey. So where can people find Anatomyth?
It's on Spotify. It's on Apple Podcasts. It's on Stitcher and Castbox and Podchaser, and also Podbean now, I believe. I think I got it on there. Then, the usual social medias, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Anatomyth Pod on Twitter.
Excellent. I will, of course, put all the links to all of your stuff in the show notes for this, so everyone can go just jump from there and go check it out. And I do highly recommend everyone do check out Anatomyth, because it is really, really fascinating, and there's some really interesting stuff in there, both from the medical side and from the mythological. I can't even say that mythological side. Yeah, I generally really enjoy what you're doing, Audrey. I think it is genuinely entertaining. What I really like is the fact that you are pulling folk tales and mythology from everywhere, from Norse to Asian to European. It seems like you've got such a wealth of material to dig into.
Yeah, I do. I really try. That's, I think, a lot of my time in terms of research goes into that, because I do believe that there are a lot of connections somewhere. And yeah, I think it enriches us when we find these connections and when we learn more about how, our ancestors thought similar to other cultures' ancestors. And like there's probably some kind of trade going on that links to that. But again, I'm not an anthropologist. I don't know these connections, these traveling migration stories. So for me, it's enough to just kind of like look into what else is out there.
Alright, gang, so there you go. That was my conversation with the wonderful Audrey from Anatomyth. As I said, a really interesting concept, and one that she is pulling off with aplomb. I just, in the 2 episodes I've listened to, have learned a whole bunch and found some really genuinely fascinating, if not kind of twisted, folk tales, which is always a great bonus. Yeah, highly recommend you go check out Anatomyth. Really, really crushing it with what she's doing there in the few episodes that she's put out, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what she does with the show as she moves further forward. What a last guest to have, right? It's pretty great if I say so myself. Yeah, last guest next week, last episode of the season. Hard to believe, but it's true. So what we're gonna do for the last episode is kind of just more of a casual sort of reflection of a few things, really. At the end of season 1, we did 2 episodes called State of the Union, which were very much centered around the current, at the time, US election. And it's kind of a theme, a concept, a gimmick, whatever you want to call it, that I want to kind of adopt for the end of each season. Not necessarily a political look back, a political reflection, but just a reflection in general, a sort of timestamp on where we are at the moment. Because really, this show was born out of a huge paradigm shift that was felt across the world. And, we ended our first season at another turning point. And so I just like the idea of bookmarking the end of these seasons with a look at where we are, what is happening, where we're going. In a big sense, in a global sense, in every sense, really. But also with the show as well. Because I feel like there has already, within the span of 2 seasons, been quite a bit of growth. I started this having no idea what I was doing, really, or what I wanted the show to be. And that is still kind of true, because I like the idea of keeping a sort of fluid identity to the show. I'm at one hand sort of shackled a little bit by the fact that there is no certain anchored topic or subject that we cover. But at the same time, not sort of pigeonholing the show, not sort of putting it in a particular box, gives it so much room to breathe and grow and investigate and explore different areas. So, yeah, I like the idea at the end of each season, taking a look at what has been, where we're at, both globally and within the show's framework as well. So, yeah, we're going to kind of be taking a little look at things in the outer world, and we're going to be taking a little look at what we've covered in season 2, and we're also going to be taking a little look, a little preview of some things that I have in store for season 3. I also want next week's episode to be an open forum for you guys, so if you have questions that you want to ask, whether that be about me, or about the show, or about some of the subjects and topics that we've covered, whether that be in season 2 or even in season 1, if you've got questions that you want to pitch my way, then please let me have them. Likewise, as we go into season 3, if you've got ideas, suggestions, recommendations, things that you would really like to see the show touch upon in its 3rd season, then do let me know. I want to hear from you guys. I've said before that I want this to be an open sandbox, collaborative type of thing, and I very, very much mean that. I mean, I can come up with stuff all day long. Trust me. Anybody that knows me to a reasonable level will know I can talk their ear off about anything. But I want you guys to let your voices be heard. I very much see this as our thing, not just mine. So yeah, if you've got questions, if you've got ideas, suggestions, what have you, do get them into me. The best way to do so is over on Twitter or Instagram. You can find me at I am Mal Foster. We do have a Facebook page for Dimed Out, but if you want more of a direct response, Twitter and Instagram's probably going to be your better route. It's also, as an added bonus, a really great way to help support the show as well. Perhaps you're new, perhaps you've just recently discovered this and you're still asking yourself, why am I listening this far in? Well, if you've got that far, you might as well continue and you might as well support us in these tiny little ways that make a big difference. So yeah, go follow us on Twitter and Instagram, as I say, at I am Mal Foster. Another great way you can support the show, probably the best way, as I usually say, is to simply subscribe. We are available on your favourite podcast platform. We are just about everywhere. So yeah, wherever you get your pods from, you can find us. Hit that little subscribe button. And not only do you help support us, but you get every episode from this point beamed to a device of your choosing without having to do anything. So yeah, everybody wins. And not to over-egg this particular pudding of drumming up support, but we do also have a Patreon account as well. So if you really, and I mean really, enjoy this show, and let's be honest, there may be a few of you that actually do, we do have, as I say, a Patreon account. You can find us at patreon.com. You can read about our single $5 tier, all the juicy bonus goodies that you can get over there as well. But that is, as I like to say, always optional. And on that note, that's about it for this week, for our penultimate episode in Season 2. As I said, next week we're going to be doing State of the Union Part 3. We're going to be taking a look at where we all are collectively and where the show is, where the show has been. And yeah, it's going to be a good time. It's going to be a celebration. So charge your glasses, get your fanciest party hats on, look after yourself, look after each other. And until next week, keep it dimed out.